All right, hello everybody and welcome to today's California Coastal Resilience Network webinar. My name is Carrie Boyle. I'm a Sea Grant Fellow at the State Coastal Conservancy and I help coordinate the California Coastal Resilience Network. Today's webinar is called Rebuilding Paradise, Implications of AB 2800 for Coastal Communities. And in a moment I'll hand it off to our speakers and I'll introduce them, but before I do that I wanted to point out that questions tab on your webinar window in case you're not already super familiar with GoToWebinar. We'll have time for questions and discussion at the end of today's webinar, so we encourage you to please type any questions you have into that box, and we'll have time to address them at the end. So with that, I'll introduce today's speakers. Today we have Dr. Susi Moser and Dr. Juliet Finzi-Hart joining us. Suzanne, or Susi, specializes in climate change adaptation, and she is the Director and Principal Research of Susi Moser Research and Consulting in Santa Cruz. And Juliet is an oceanographer with the U.S. Geological Survey's Pacific Coastal and Marine Science Center, which is also based, and she's also based in Santa Cruz. And the two of them have been incredibly involved in the state of California's climate change assessments and adaptation planning, and both of them have worked on a number of projects that I do not have time to list today, but most relevant to today's talk is that they were co-facilitators of the Climate-Safe Infrastructure Working Group. And this working group recently released a report, which you can download from that handout section of your webinar window. And today they'll tell us more about that report and specifically about its implications for coastal climate adaptation planning. So with that, I will hand it off to you, Susi.
Great. Thank you so much, Carrie. I really appreciate you inviting us to give this webinar, and welcome to everyone to your lunch break. I just quickly want to say two things. One is, for those of you who know, I have actually not moved back to Santa Cruz. I am giving this webinar from the cold shores of Massachusetts. And Juliet, unfortunately, today is unavailable to join us. Her computer crashed and she is in IT hell. So I'm sorry to disappoint those of you who are hoping to hear her voice in this, but all her good vibes and thinking is in this presentation. So we put it together, and so that's what I'm going to share today. So what I want to share with you is about AB 2800 and the report that we produced, which was really about infrastructure broadly. As you can sort of see in these pictures here, that was the charge that we got through that particular bill. I'll come back to it in a moment. But you know, for reasons that are not very far-fetched, we renamed this webinar, at least, to Rebuilding Paradise, Come Hell and High Water, given the recent events, sad events in California. You know, I don't need to say much about this. You all have seen this, heard it, smelled it, almost choked on it. So this is, you know, obviously the kind of context in which a conversation about how to rebuild and all the infrastructure that goes with rebuilding an entire community comes up. You know, you see this in images like these where, you know, nearly 19,000 structures were destroyed. And of course, with it, a lot of the infrastructure. In this image here, you see a telephone pole somewhere there in the background. So communication infrastructure is destroyed, electricity lines. This town, as you know, is one of the largest remaining towns in California on septic systems. So, you know, now in this unfortunate opportunity to rebuild it, should it go back to that same system, or should a new water system be built? And everything from, you know, the roads, bridges, and culverts, and everything that goes with transportation infrastructure, and of course things like schools, health facilities, business. All of these things are not just in private hand, but in a mix of private and public infrastructure developers, and that needs to be now rethought. And of course, you know, this is the transition to the coast. This isn't all that far fetched from what you all are concerned with. The Woolsey fire burned at the same time. Fortunately was not quite as destructive in terms of numbers of big buildings or people who perished. But with that fire, it became a coastal issue. If you look at this map here, you see how far eventually the Woolsey fire reached, all the way down to the ocean, destroyed buildings, again, electricity, communication lines, just to give you a real picture of what that looked like. Including elements of the coastal trail, or here reaching over the Highway 1, and impacting, of course, all the infrastructure alongside it. And of course, what comes right after that, and this is a refrain that we seem to have gotten used to by now in California, you know, inevitably the rain will come, for good and or for worse, and it will wash down all the mud and debris, causing not just impacts on water and transportation infrastructure, but also causing water quality issues, all of which are falling right central in all your management responsibilities. So there is the primary and the secondary threats that come from these kinds of events. And as you know, this is the refrain. These are pictures that we had before we did the AB 2800 report, because they're from last year, and this is the exact same sequence, right, of extreme heat, extended drought, followed by fire, inevitably followed by rain and mudslides. And this is the stuff, exactly the stuff that changing climate is going to bring more and in worse format to us. But that's really only half the problem. The other half of the infrastructure problem that we're all facing is depicted in these pictures. We have aging infrastructure. I'm showing here a canal in the Central Valley that, for all the sinking of the land has basically brought the water level up to the bottom of that particular bridge. We have the largest, potholes in wherever you go, wherever you want to, but the biggest ones you find in low-income communities, disadvantaged communities. And then, of course, we have the challenge that we're not just, building, rebuilding, maintaining this infrastructure to the same type of infrastructure, but we're actually looking forward over the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years to completely change the infrastructure. Electricity infrastructure being just one example. Transportation becoming electrified, moving to distributed energy systems. You're not building to the same thing and have to fortify the same thing, but you have to, place this new infrastructure in new places. And on top of that, there are projections that by the middle of the century, we will have 50 million people in California. And all those people need to be served with whatever infrastructure they all need in all these sectors. So the combination between more, extreme events, more changes, moving outside historical ranges of what's been known to stress these systems, together with old and new and completely changing infrastructure, is really the challenge that California faces. And, I don't need to say a heck of a lot about this. Many of you will have heard about this report coming out about a month ago. Things are not going to get any easier than they already are. In fact, that report calls for a rapid transformation of all our systems to make that transition to stay or to return to 1.5 degrees. What's interesting about it, and I'll point this out here, the report mentions the many barriers that already face us in making these transitions. These are the exact same barriers why we haven't dealt with deferred maintenance and things like that before, economic in particular. And this report calls for a greater investment in both the physical and, I emphasize, the social infrastructure to make this happen. So we're going to hear that echoed in our report. This came out before we published ours, after we published ours, but it very much reiterates the challenge before us. And so really where we're starting from in this presentation won't surprise you, but I think is a really hard one to recognize, which is that our infrastructure must be resilient and sustainable in the face of these growing threats and changes, and yet we're not even close to that. Now, this is not a recognition that is completely new. You hear that in infrastructure plans, 5-year plans, again and again in the state. Maybe it's just never been quite so crystal clear as this year, given the challenges we've seen in Paradise and with the Woolsey fire in Malibu and so on. So a little bit of background on why we did this. Again, this started prior to those most recent events. The Assembly Bill 2800 by Assembly Member Quirk basically was mandated to, or put forward the mandate to not fully address this entire problem. It focused us specifically on if we wanted to bring forward-looking climate science into infrastructure planning and design, what would need to happen? What would we need to make that possible? So we were, asked to look at climate change science. What do we know about the threats to infrastructure? What do engineers and architects need to move that information into their planning and design processes, and even further down into construction, operation and maintenance, and I would say all the way to decommissioning. So that was the overarching charge and purpose. We had 3 specific recommendations or things we needed to look at. Namely, what are the informational institutional barriers to actually integrating this information into design? What are the critical information needs of engineers? And when I say engineers, this is the text of the bill. I always mean end architects, because the rest of the bill actually included the state architects and others in this. And then finally, in face of the uncertainty that we're looking at, what would be an appropriate process to select designs in the face of this, the different climate scenarios that are out there. So that's what our charge was. Here is the working group with us as the co-facilitators on the left, and the project team largely from the Natural Resources Agency and the California Energy Commission. But really the main part of the show is the folks, the 16 folks in the middle. And that is a combination of climate scientists, other types of scientists, economists, and so on, folks who are experts in decision-making under uncertainty, but also engineers, both academically and practically working. So state engineers from transportation, from water, from the building sector, and from the energy sector. That doesn't cover the waterfront. I want to just be very explicit. We haven't had, on this particular group, the experts in all other types of infrastructure the state has a mandate over. Green infrastructure is not a very strong emphasis. Everyone recognizes it, but it wasn't represented per se. And so that is the reason why we actually developed the process that would bring that external expertise into the process. We had a very short amount of time with the working group per se, to meet basically once a month from January through June. And in those working group meetings, a lot of work had to get done. So we structured it and focused it very strongly, got them all working. You see a picture here on the right where they were figuring out what do we want to achieve. We had them work on, on spreadsheets and whatnot the entire time. We gave them homework and so on and so forth. But as I said, in addition to that, we also decided we needed to have an opportunity to communicate what the members of the working group bring to the table, what they face, what they are already doing to interested stakeholders, to the public. But we also needed to bring in expertise into the working group process to fill those gaps that we didn't have represented on the working group. So we had this ongoing webinar series. I think there were 17 sessions altogether. Maybe some of you participated in that. And it was a very interesting and very influential series, which we extracted from very heavily to integrate finally with the literature and other outreach that we did all along the way. And with all the experts that came to the working group, we integrated all of that into that final report. And this is the one that we came out with in late August, beginning of September. Some of you may have seen some of that work. As you can see from the title, we think of what the state really needs to do is, best captured in this phrase of paying it forward. The investment now must work for both us now, but also for the future. It must address the challenges we already face. It can't wait, and what happens now cannot be postponed, cannot disregard climate change. So, but it needs to really, be thought of as an investment in the future of California. The report is quite lengthy, 160 pages, but we have the 10th of that as an executive summary. So if you don't have much time, that would be the thing I would recommend. However, on this website that you see here, if you simply search for Climate Safe Infrastructure Working Group, you get to it. We have all the appendices and all the additional material that was produced, like the webinars and the meeting materials and summaries, all at that particular website. So it's a very rich source. And just as another sort of pointer, we had about 220 or so references cited in the report. 98% of them are hyperlinked, so you all can get to that as well. It's an incredibly rich resource for all of you to take it forward. This is sort of the structure of it. After a little introduction to basically say what we're supposed to do, we focused on the problem and that two-dimensional problem that I painted for you early on in this presentation. And then we actually spent a time thinking about, well, what would it mean to have climate-safe infrastructure in the state? What would be our vision, if you will? It's a very important one. I'll come back to it in a moment. And then how do you realize that vision on the ground? And that's what those 5 chapters that come afterwards are really all about. Each one focuses on a particular piece of the puzzle to get from this high, this ambitious vision to it being built on the ground. So let me talk about each of those in a little bit more in detail so you get a sense of what's in there. This vision can maybe be best characterized by this particular graphic. California already has a really strong vision and ambition in reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. It is on a pathway that is consistent with the Paris Accord of getting to no more than 2 and hopefully less than 2 degrees of warming. It is codified in laws and policies and codes and rules, and that's all, we are moving steadily toward that goal. California doesn't have anything nearly as strong as that for adaptation. So what we're saying, it's wonderful if California continues to do that and is a global leader, but what if, and it's not such a huge if, what if the rest of the world doesn't follow that example? And we will get much worse climate change than what we in California are actually aiming for. What if we get a business as usual scenario, high emissions pathway, with all the consequences that has globally? And unfortunately, that is the situation we live in, that we have a shared atmosphere and everyone's actions add up. So in order to be climate safe, if you will, we ought to be actually aiming on the one end for the best possible scenario we can aim for, but should protect ourselves against the possibilities of a high-end climate future. And that space between those two, essentially, that is, a climate-safe space that we can create in the state. What's important is that we do both emission reductions and preparedness and adaptation with a lens to social equity. And why? Well, let me go to this first. I'll come back to the pathway in a moment. Why that? Because the largest potholes are in the longest rejected and neglected areas of our state and of society. Where we have least invested in in infrastructure at all, and where we basically have the greatest social inequalities. And so one of the things the state has been criticized for over 2 decades now is to have no clear strategies of how to solve its infrastructure problems. What we're suggesting here is that if you look at where the greatest climate risks are, where the greatest infrastructure investment gaps are, and where you can make the biggest difference with regard to social inequality, where that overlaps, that could be your highest priority of investment. And where you overlap at least 2 of them are sort of your secondary priorities for investment. That would go a long way toward actually, at least answering the call for a clear strategy. And that should be really, a focus on social equity in research, in the way projects are developed and prioritized, who and how decisions get made, where the finance goes, but also how the financing is made available. It should involve workforce development, procurement guidelines, and also should be reflected in what you monitor and evaluate. It's not just about, is the bridge strong enough, but did the bridge help the poorest get to their jobs the best? That's sort of the kind of idea. Let me go back one step here to say more word about, moving toward protection against a worst case or worse scenario. we're thinking of that not as something that you do in all decisions now in one fell swoop. It's just exactly the same way that we're not asking people now to reduce their emissions by 100% tomorrow. We don't. We have targets that change over time. What if we had a similar set of, a strong target, so that at every decision point you would have to ask, can I build this infrastructure in a way that if I need it, I can upgrade it, I can move it, I can be more flexible, I can, make it last, if you will, even under worse climate conditions. That is the essential idea behind an adaptation pathway. You don't go there in one full swoop, you go there in step by step, given defined triggers or simply by the decisions that you make. But at every one of those decision points, ask, can I build this in a way that it can be upgraded, if you will, so that if you need it, you can do that. If you don't need that, well, great, wonderful. Then, if the world collectively does not aim for 4 degrees, wonderful. We are not asking you to all overbuild, overprotect for something that may not be needed. Unfortunately, we don't seem to be heading toward a great future at the moment, but if we don't need it, if we also suggest in the report there ought to be an off-ramp. Now that involves a lot of political and scientific questions. So we don't say here's when to go on that off-ramp. We basically say that needs a lot more study if and when there is such a point. Let me move on to say, okay, so if that's our vision of both having a mitigation and adaptation target and always prioritizing social equity in that, how do you actually make that happen on the ground? And here we're borrowing something from John Cleveland, who first came up with this basic approach that I'm just putting forward here to you, which is it takes a system framework to get to action. That involves the data and analytics. Absolutely, we need the science. That needs to be in place. There is a lot that needs to change in terms of the project pipeline development, the planning process to get things ready to be built. We need to do work around the governance, and that includes the codes and standards, and also some of the financial institutions we might need to actually receive money for systemic sort of approaches to infrastructure development. We need the financing tools, obviously, to make that happen, and that's a whole big, area of work, not just in getting the money, but even assessing how much money do we need? How do you make the case for building better over the entire life cycle of a piece of infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And then we actually also still need other pieces toward the end that is about making sure there are skilled professionals who can actually do this kind of work, that there are accountability mechanisms, that we don't undermine ourselves through waivers and extreme events and things like that. And of course, setting up, and we always say it, nobody ever does it really, but we always say we need to actually know more how well these pieces of infrastructure are doing through monitoring and evaluation. And I think that becomes increasingly important because that's what investors want to know. Is this piece of infrastructure a better one to invest in versus this one over here? And in order for you to be able to answer that questions, we need monitoring and evaluation to be a principal part of how we build infrastructure. And of course, there's coordination and integration across all of that. So I'm just going to say a few more words on each one of these, just so you know what's in each of these chapters, and then come to the recommendations. So what we did over the course of this process really is to look at what all the information is that is currently being used by engineers and architects, what they need if they wanted to take forward-looking climate science into account, what of that they already have, and if the form in which it's available is actually accessible to them or not. And all of that is available right now in the appendices, so you can take a look at that. What we did find very quickly in that discussion is that in order for an engineer and architect to really plan their infrastructure, they need a lot more than climate science. We demand that people look at population change and land use changes, and yet they're done at this point in such a simplistic way they do not account for sort of the real historical dynamics of how these things change. And it ought to be, you know, at a much higher, more sophisticated level. We ask that for that kind of sophistication with climate science. We don't ask it of the other pieces. And so we try to, you know, say, well, that could change. There is very little known in the engineering world about social inequities and vulnerabilities, even though some of that information is available, but it's not fully integrated. They don't know where to find the data, and it's not evenly available. So how to do that, how to make that accessible to folks who need it in that realm is very important. There's not a lot of high quality information on the economics of what it costs to adapt, or what the cost of inaction is, and what is available. Everyone uses a different methodology. We think there's a really big, important piece of work that's to be done. And sorry, let me go back here. My Adobe wants to just now update. Let's see if we can avoid that for another 45 minutes. We also think that, you know, it's important that we move from the simplistic cost-benefit analyses that are commonly used to full life cycle assessments and a more sophisticated valuation of costs and benefits. We need to learn a lot more about adaptively designing infrastructure. It's a totally emergent area of work within engineering. We were also asked to look at whether or not the scientists and engineers need new platforms, tools, or processes to facilitate their interaction. And basically what we said is there's a lot out there, but they're not connected and they're not accessible necessarily for both, and they're not used properly. So for example, why does the California Adaptation Forum not have a standing roundtable of scientists and engineers to come together and you know, teach each other about what they need and address those issues and begin to build those relationships? We know from many years of research on how to best make science usable that that is necessary, but it's not easily done. So we think much needs to be changed there. On the planning side, basically we suggest that, you know, a lot of engineers don't go to graduate school and learn how to do meaningful engagement. They think of it in a very linear fashion, not iteratively. They plan for one piece, not systemically, of how that infrastructure functions and sits within an entire system of uses and benefits. You know, how to screen for climate impact so you know how intensively you need to take that into account. Calculating project feasibility, both economically and in other, along other dimensions. How to do probabilistic risk management and assessment is not something, you know, again, uncertainty, decision making, those kinds of things are not very sophisticatedly taught in engineering school. And I think those are areas to improve. There are many trainings and tools out there, but they're not necessarily known. So there's, if you think about how important it is, about how important the planning phase is for everything that follows, you can see why this piece needs to be done really, really well in order for the right projects to go forward. On the governance side, we review in that chapter quite a bit how standards, codes, and guidelines are set, how much the state agencies actually can influence that. We compile them. Again, you can find them in the appendices, so you know how many different standards and codes go into actually building any one piece of it. But there are really challenges that many agencies face in whether or not they have control over you know, changing those guidelines. Many of them wait for professional societies or standard setting organizations to hand those down to them, and they may or may not be in process. So what can the state do? And you know, how do you maybe shift what's happening through the guidelines that a state can set? So we have a lot of suggestions there around performance standards, voluntary standards, manuals of practice. The American Society for Civil Engineers just came out with a national manual of practice, you know, and we think this is an opportunity to do something that's much more California focused, but that would really influence the practice of engineering on the ground. One of the things that came up in this context was liability. Many of you will have questions around that, is my guess, but engineers basically do what they do following professional norms and standards, and to the extent they do that, they are in compliance and they can get liability insurance. If we start asking them to do something that's not part of that canon, that raises a lot of liability concerns. And that's just one example of liability issues that comes up. We think this is such a crucial and important issue, it ought to be dealt with more fully by a follow-on activity. And again, we don't have at the moment any institutions that say, you know, let's think about water and energy, communication and transportation infrastructure all together. We don't have that at the moment. But you know, those kinds of ways of bringing together the planning activities across sectors is crucially important. Around the infrastructure finance, it's actually, I think, a pretty interesting chapter in that it reviews what's happened in California around financing infrastructure over the last several decades, and the many structural challenges to changing the way we finance infrastructure. So that's just a place where we start, and you know what we have to contend with and what we have to work with. But it also invites much more fundamental conversations about, is that maybe the way we want to go? Obviously, there are the potentially added costs of building differently in the face of climate change, but how to do that? You know, there is no one set of tools or one approach to doing that, no one methodology. And I think the state could actually help itself a lot to establish such, you know, some set of tools that is just for that. How to account for climate change in finance is a whole other question that we didn't get into in great detail, but we recognize is an important challenge. And again, the specific data and analytics that are required to do that, I think are not there at the moment and are really important. We talk about the different ways one can think about funding and financing infrastructure, whether it's dedicated funding pots through particular bond measures or propositions, or whether you know you want to simply say every project, no matter what, has to think through climate change, and that requires state level policy to make that happen, right? So there are emerging innovative financing tools. We all know about those. They're incredibly difficult to access and to actually implement, especially for smaller communities. The state could be a model for testing some of those. And then finally, in this 9th chapter, which I think is just as important, gets often forgotten, we talk about the people who actually make it happen on the ground. And that means training and capacity building within the workforce. And I just want to say, what we think is necessary for the workforce to come up to climate change awareness and understanding and being able to do all the things that I just walked through, that comes on top of the existing workforce issues already present in the transportation sector, in any one of those sectors. There are simply not enough people. People are retiring, and so all of a sudden you're going to ask people to now add on this whole new skill set. And that needs to be addressed head on if we want to make this happen. So we also talk about statewide coordination across agencies, translating that state policy into project level guidance. So here again, this California Manual of Practice, procurement guidance, incentives, permitting, waiver guidance, you know, those sorts of things, particularly around code changes. I don't know if you're aware, but basically when you know, if the prevailing code is not already taking climate change into account, if you had the unfortunate opportunity to rebuild after something like a major wildfire or a coastal storm or whatever, you know, you could only use federal disaster funds to rebuild to that the pre-existing code. So encouraging communities to actually change their code so that that money can actually go toward building back better, as opposed to building back to the same maladaptive situation that we were in before. That would seem just like a logical next step. Having metrics of performance and success is a piece of work. Some of you know that I've worked on this for quite a number of years, and it's really, really challenging, also challenged by the capacity limitations that many of you have. And then, of course, there's the question of what actually is best practice, and can we, you know, pilot that? Can we have demonstration projects around that? So our recommendations are really exactly addressing each one of these items. I go through it fairly quickly now. The first one is to adopt this vision that we have as statewide policy, put something as stringent in place as we have for, say, AB 32, you know, for the emission side. On the data and analytics side, you may or may not know that California has been funding climate change research on a fairly ad hoc basis. But if you want people to use that on a regular basis in their decision making, you better make sure that they actually get the science that they need, right? So putting a permanent source of funding in place so that that information you want gets produced reliably and readily, that's really important. And, you know, the next recommendation is, again, about funding, but it's really broader than that. There are many, many bureaucratic hurdles for state employees to go to scientific conferences, to interact with, you know, with the researchers. And so can we find ways to lower the barriers and really help the two communities come together so that they can actually talk to each other about what science is really needed, seems to us as a really crucial point. Around the planning process, we think it's really important to invest in staff capacity to improve the project development around all the dimensions I mentioned earlier, and particularly to provide guidance around effective stakeholder engagement. That is just not something that people get taught in graduate school. If we want them to be able to be culturally competent, to engage effectively with low-income communities, whatever it is, you know, even understand the importance and the discussion and the challenges with, you know, all this legacy of institutionalized racism and whatnot. They have to learn about it, and this is something that the Strategic Growth Council and others who are really expert in engagement could put forward as state guidance. Around the governance structure, it's a fairly complicated recommendations which recognizes that different agencies vary in their capacity to affect their own standards and codes that they use, but to the extent they can, we think they should update those that they have that really requires them to look toward the future with climate change and other types of changes you know, that happen in society. Or to work alternatively through the relevant professional societies and standard setting organizations to get those updated if they don't have control over it themselves. And in the meantime, to develop guidelines to basically, you know, just improve the practice that's already out there. The working through liability issues, we think, is one of the biggest hurdles that needs to be tackled. Around the financing, you know, it's always easy to say, just we need more money, but it's a much more complicated issue. And that we suggest that it should start with actually assessing the true costs over the full life cycle of infrastructure, and to really take a systemic view and improve the tools available to assessing the costs and benefits, and helping people to use those tools effectively. So those are really important pieces. Around implementation, someone better start developing a work plan on how to address the training and professional development gaps. We think that the Strategic Growth Council can start with that. We also suggest that there be a standing climate-safe infrastructure working group to continue to make sure that these issues stay on the forefront and that they get coordinated across agencies. And then finally, to, you know, have that working group or another sort of work group from it, stemming from it, that really works through some of these very detailed, you know, issues like manuals, contracting language, incentives. How do you do that? If the state were to set this as a model and provided it to others, it could spread much more quickly than if everybody had to figure this out themselves. So just to come to conclusion here and sort of bring it back to what does this all mean to you? Our work continues. We've been briefing the legislature and the Strategic Growth Council on the report since they asked for it. We're giving presentations like, you know, this one right now, but also to at academic conferences, so that really raise awareness of the needs from both on both sides, the practice and the academic side. We stand ready to support the political process and to raise more awareness by participating in the regional outreach events that are created through the Climate Change Force Assessment. You know, we're doing outreach to organizations, professional societies. There's an annual meeting of the California American Society of Civil Engineers, California chapter, And it's those kinds of things to just basically bring people around to recognize the necessity and to generate more efforts. A lot of our working group members are also going out on their own, speaking to these different organizations and essentially raising hell in their professional organizations, and that's probably the most effective to take it forward. So what does it all mean to you? If you are obviously at a state level, then that's great, you can take it forward, but whether it means anything to you probably depends on how much you agree with any part of what we're suggesting. And obviously, if you're living in California, it also depends on whether the state takes up any of these recommendations and implements them. I know there are some discussions going on with that already, but if there is a state policy, at least all of those of you in California will be affected by it. But let me walk through it in a more specific way. So focusing on the vision, if you think through your own work, wherever you sit, whether you're in an NGO or in a local community, think about what that vision that we put forward would mean for you, and can you adopt, at least in principle, that vision in your own work? So how would it change then your own approaches to what you're doing? On the data analytics, you might review the needs and you might find your own, you might add that when the opportunity arises to either do some of that research or ask for it, or suggest that those be foci in the state strategic research plan. Those are opportunities to make them known. Around planning, again, look at your own processes. Where do you feel you fall short and you could improve the planning process? And you can use that chapter to sort of check against your own processes and see where it needs help, maybe where you don't have the internal capacity, where you could improve things or coordinate at least better across sectors. Around the structures and codes and things like that, particularly if you're in local government, thinking about whether or not your building codes, your guidelines to folks actually already consider climate change really as a legal mandate. That would be an enormously important way to move forward. Just think about, in Paradise, people can only use federal disaster rebuilding funds to build back to where they were before, but they cannot use it toward building back better. That's just such a waste. I mean, that basically guarantees we're going to be maladaptive for as long as we stay with those codes. So what can you do in that way to adjust those guidelines and codes? Obviously, there might be some of you who are actually, providing adaptation services. You might provide technical assistance to local governments or other entities. What can you do in that regard? And again, here on the last step, identify your own professional development needs. What are you doing on monitoring and evaluation? Can you help with identifying those indicators of success or progress in light of the vision that we put forward? Maybe it requires getting training or setting the expectations right for the people in your own staff or for those who provide services to you. And then finally, on the coordination and iterativity, again, can you identify areas where you need improved communication coordination, where you can be more adaptive in your process and how you implement things. The last thing I'll say, because these are things that are coming up within the Coastal Commission and in other areas, and it really goes across the entire coastal sector. Infrastructure, in many ways, when it is there, it essentially draws or begets development, right? And by the same token, you can say, if you maintain critical infrastructure in certain ways, you basically maintain people's exposure to coastal hazards. So if you keep building Highway 1 back in the same way again and again, then basically you just maintain its exposure. So there are such opportunities to think about land use and infrastructure together. We don't do that on a regular basis, but that's a really important area for thinking about how to become more adaptive. There might also be policies that aim to move people out of harm's way. The Coastal Commission is already sort of moving toward at least encouraging managed retreat, But if that's the case, then infrastructure planning must adjust to that expectation, and not just in that very place that is retreating, but where are all these people going? I have a little image here from a study that some of you know. Howard came out with this, just basically looking at if people retreat from the coast, where will they go? And this particular graphic basically shows where they will all go. California is in the light green on the lower right. So people moving away from the California coast will go to a lot of other places that you can see. It's hard to see, but you get the idea. We're going to move away from the coast, and infrastructure planning must reflect that. And with that comes really a need to move from the more reactive adaptation approaches, like, okay, a storm happened, a flood happened, a fire happened, we're doing something, to moving more proactively to thinking about, what do we need? How do we build forward as opposed to backwards? And then the final thing I'll say is about safeguarding and its future renditions. Every sector provides its chapter, but what we have found is the critical importance of sectors to start to think of, systemic interrelationships across them. And I hope that came through in some of this presentation too. So maybe 3.0 or maybe 4.0, can we get towards increasingly integrated adaptation planning, maybe by region, but looking at it in that way as well. And so with that, I'll just open it to questions and answers.
Great, thank you so much, Susie. So folks on the line, please type away in that questions box. We do have one question so far from Jack Leester, and he is wondering, you've identified many areas where new state policies are required. What is being pursued right now? Considering the legislature can only handle a limited number of actions, which of the identified needs do you think should get priority?
It's a really good question, and we were just recently asked that in the legislative briefing that we did as well. I think there is, I mean, this is not a cop-out, but I think there is a really important shift in thinking that needs to happen. If you think back to this image that I had of it takes a system, if you did only one thing in any one of these areas, whether it's the data part or the planning part or the finance part, none of it would actually help you move the ball down the road, because you would run into the other barriers of things not being, the data not being there, the planning process being shitty, whatever. So you could run into that kind of approach. So while I recognize that it's crucially important, I think the general approach that I would say that is important is to keep insisting on, we need to work on multiple fronts on this, because otherwise, we just won't get there. At the same time, I think you can do a lot with different types of approaches. So for example, if you provide funding should come with the requirement to do some of what we call for, right? So if you get state funding, you must update your building codes or something of that nature, so that you begin to address, an immediate need, and everyone has immediate needs, but you also start to, move the ball down the park here in terms of getting some of the other pieces in place. And I think, something like Paradise just shows us this absolute enormous need to make sure that, you actually then build back better. I mean, I cannot even think of how many billions of dollars we could potentially spend that would be misspent in light of climate change. They would, of course, get the buildings back and get the people back, but is it really the way we would want it to be rebuilt? So when we have that opportunity, there is, a lot of, so I'll give you another example of why just fixing one thing won't help. So a lot of people push bond funding because that's, of course, something that, is the type of approach we have used with infrastructure financing, and it's a very important vehicle, if you will. You cannot use bond funding for the operation and maintenance of infrastructure. So you can build new stuff, but you can't maintain it. That has to come out of your existing funds. So, it's like, we can push on the finance instruments, but if we don't address, some of the other issues and how infrastructure ought to be maintained, how it should be upgraded, I feel like we're just not doing ourselves a lot of favors. In fact, there is money right now on the books that's available that is not being issued, bond funding not being issued because we can't actually maintain the infrastructure we're building. So, those are the ways in which we have to really recognize that this systemic approach is a really crucial one. There are many, many small things we can do, like, reducing those hurdles of state engineers and architects to be able to go to climate conferences and things like that. That would help enormously. And that isn't hard. That isn't that hard to do. While I say that, I'm sure every rule change gives someone a major headache. But, in light of, if you think about the magnitude of the challenge coming, that seems like the smallest of the potatoes to get right. So it's just a couple of examples of, where you can maybe, by the way you approach something, make sure that you begin to address both immediate and future needs.
Right, thanks. The next question comes from Alex Loomer. She's wondering, how can we ensure natural infrastructure is being prioritized in these efforts for Executive Order B3015, AB 1482, and the Safeguarding California Plan?
Yeah, it's a great point. A lot of what we're saying is actually extension of existing state policy, and the prioritization of green infrastructure is an example of that. There's already, you mentioned the executive orders and the other bills. There's also the guidance that came out of OPR that basically reiterates that point to give priority to that. I think what it illustrates is, when we ask around, well, how come you guys aren't using more green infrastructure? We basically had someone speak at a webinar that was all about green infrastructure, and they said there are professional norms that bias engineers against it. This is the kind of stuff where, the workforce development, the capacity building, getting people to see that it works and in what ways it works, so having the measures of success and effectiveness, those are the kinds of things that would help make the case, and in fact help make it into professional standards, to make that a normal part of what an engineer does. If it isn't within their codes and guidelines and standards, and if they do not feel comfortable, if it's against their professional norms, it's going to be incredibly hard to do that. They're also in many ways complex to build, often involve multiple landowners and people with very different agendas, and oh God, that's hard for an engineer. This is where the soft side of engineering comes in, right? The human interactions, the invisible rules that make happen what happens. So I think this is why we so emphasize the workforce development and the back end of this problem, which is can you show that it's working?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Our maybe final question comes from Susan Jordan, and her question concerns how to assist those who want to help in the rebuilding in the wake of the Woolsey fire. They have some funding but need experts as soon as possible, but she doesn't see any coherent sources for them to connect to for guidance.
Yeah, gosh, I wish I had that answer. I think one of the possibilities, and I really, this is not me thinking out loud, is there are multiple jurisdictions that need to be at the table. I don't know whether or not the climate collaborative in that region, would be the right entity, or whether it's a regional sort of, collection of governments coming together to jointly think about it. But essentially, talking to the leadership there and insisting that all the sectors, all the jurisdictions are at the table to figure this out, and have the state folks who need to give permits, have the federal folks who need to give permits right at the table, I mean, essentially, you know, in the absence of a existing institutional structure, very rapidly calling for an informal structure, namely a coordination table, you know, come together to talk to each other. So at least people are aware of each other. They learn of the information at the same time. You don't get into turf wars and competitions and all that stupid stuff that comes up in those moments. I mean, that to me seems to be the most important thing we can do, not having a formal structure. You know, and those of us who are not involved directly work on the formal structure, so these sorts of things happen on a regular basis immediately. I don't know. What do you think? I'd love to know if there's a way for people to speak up or if you can unmute them, but it seems to me a really important aspect to build informal, quick responses in the absence of having something more formal.
Yeah. Well, I think that those are all the questions that we have so far. I will be sure to send a link to the recording once it's uploaded, and also some information about how to sign up and keep in touch with the network. But I want to thank you so much for joining us, Susie. This has been a really informative webinar, so thanks for taking the time to talk to us today. And thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and that you have a safe and happy holiday. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, and here are our contacts, so if you want to follow up, happy to continue the conversation. So thank you all for attending and happy holidays.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.